The first explosions were not meant to be heard by civilians. They were meant to be felt, deep, distant, confusing. For a few seconds, nothing made sense. Air defense operators on the ground thought it was another false alarm. Radar screens flickered. A warning tone rose, then cut out. Somewhere above the clouds, a Ukrainian jet had already crossed the invisible line, moving fast, low, and quiet. What happened next would ripple far beyond the base itself, triggering reactions that neither side publicly admits they expected. For months, the air war over Ukraine had followed a familiar rhythm. Drones probing defenses, missiles launched from a distance, aircraft rarely venturing too close to heavily defended zones. Jets were symbols more than tools, kept back to avoid losses. But that night, something changed. Ukrainian planners, facing constant pressure on the ground, chose speed over safety. They chose risk over routine. And they chose a target that Moscow considered secure. The Russian base sat far from the front lines, protected by layered air defenses and distance itself. It was not just a military facility, it was a statement. Aircraft parked there supported operations across a wide region. Ammunition depots fed ongoing strikes. Command units coordinated movements hundreds of kilometers away. Hitting it would not just damage hardware, it would challenge assumptions. The Ukrainian jet did not arrive alone. It was part of a carefully timed sequence. Electronic noise flooded the airspace minutes earlier, confusing radars and forcing operators to switch modes. At the same time, small drones approached from unexpected directions, not to cause damage, but to draw attention. Air defense crews locked onto the wrong threats. Missiles were launched into empty sky. Then the jet came in. Flying low to avoid detection, it climbed only at the last moment. The pilot had seconds, not minutes. Precision mattered more than survival. Weapons were released in rapid succession, guided by coordinates prepared long before takeoff. The jet did not linger. It turned sharply, dropping back toward the terrain, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. On the ground, the impact was immediate. One strike hit the edge of the base, tearing through storage structures. Another detonated near parked equipment. Fires broke out, feeding on fuel and stored supplies. Secondary explosions followed, sharp, violent bursts that confirmed what had been hit. Within minutes, the base was no longer just a target. It was a crisis. Russian response systems kicked in late. Air defenses fired after the jet was already gone. Emergency crews rushed in as alarms blared. Communications flooded command channels, each unit reporting partial information, none with the full picture. Smoke rose into the night sky, visible from kilometers away. Within hours, the first statements appeared. Russian officials described a limited incident, insisting defenses had functioned and damage was minimal. No mention was made of jets penetrating airspace. Ukrainian officials, for their part, said little. They let the silence speak, releasing only vague hints that operations continue as planned. But the story did not stay quiet. Satellite images emerged the next day. Analysts began marking scorch patterns and collapsed roofs. Independent observers noted unusual damage inconsistent with drone strikes alone. Military bloggers on both sides argued fiercely, some calling it impossible, others pointing out subtle signs that suggested a manned aircraft had been involved. And then came what no one publicly expected. Instead of escalating immediately, Russia paused. Flights from nearby bases were temporarily reduced. Aircraft were dispersed to secondary locations. Some units were moved further inland. It was not announced, but it was visible. The strike had forced a rethink. Behind closed doors, the implications were heavier. If Ukrainian jets could reach that base, then other sites were vulnerable too. Air defenses that looked strong on paper had gaps in reality. Assumptions made early in the war no longer held. Technology had evolved. Tactics had adapted. For Ukraine, the message was equally complex. The strike was a success, but also a warning. Sending jets into heavily defended airspace carried enormous risk. One miscalculation could mean losing pilots that were irreplaceable. The operation could not become routine. It had to remain rare, unexpected, and carefully chosen. As days passed, more details surfaced indirectly. Russian repair crews worked around the clock. Damaged runways were patched. Equipment was moved undercover. Ukrainian air activity shifted again, returning mostly to drones and standoff weapons. The jet strike remained an exception, not a new rule. Yet the psychological impact lingered. On Russian military forums, questions appeared that had not been asked before. How had the jet avoided detection for so long? Why had air defenses responded late? Were current systems enough, or were they optimized for a different kind of war? Official answers were scarce. On the Ukrainian side, the strike became a quiet reference point. Not a public victory parade, but a reminder of capability. Proof that, under the right conditions, limits could be pushed. That the air was still contested, not owned. International observers watched closely. Western analysts debated whether this signaled a new phase of the air war or a one-off operation. Some argued it showed growing Ukrainian confidence and improved coordination. Others warned that it could provoke harsher responses if repeated. What followed in the weeks after was subtle but telling. Russian aircraft began flying from more distant bases, increasing flight times and reducing sortie rates. Some missile launches shifted locations. Air defense deployments were adjusted, creating thicker coverage around assets once considered safe. None of this was framed as a reaction, but the timing spoke volumes. Ukraine, meanwhile, leaned harder into unpredictability. Smaller, more frequent actions combined with occasional bold moves. The jet strike fit into that pattern, not as a turning point by itself, but as part of a broader strategy of pressure and uncertainty. The base itself eventually returned to operation, at least partially. Militaries adapt quickly. Damage is repaired. Losses are absorbed. But memory is harder to erase. Every radar alert after that carried a little more tension. Every unidentified blip was taken more seriously. In war, moments like these matter not just for what they destroy, but for what they change in the mind of the opponent. The strike did not end the conflict. It did not decide the war. But it altered calculations. A line that once felt solid now felt thinner. And that was the real outcome. Because long after the smoke cleared and the headlines moved on, planners on both sides were forced to accept the same uncomfortable truth: the airspace was no longer predictable. What had been considered unlikely was now possible. And in a conflict defined by adaptation, that shift mattered more than any single explosion. The Ukrainian jet had come and gone in minutes. But the consequences stayed.